So it says it's recording, so. There's a few people said they couldn't come, so they'd like to hear what was happening, so.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we wait another half a minute, John? So.
Sure, no problem, yeah.
Okay. There's somebody.
John's sitting outside Parliament House, are you, John? Where?
No, this is the University of Queensland in the background. So
That's Queensland, is it?
Yes.
That's why you've only got a T-shirt on. You're not down here.
No, that's right. No, it's lovely and warm. A bit of a breeze, but apart from that, it's very pleasant here.
We've got another couple just turned up. Mark Carter, who's Flight Free Australia.
Okay.
There's Alfred.
Hi, Roberts. Hi, everybody.
You there, Mark?
Oh, he's there listening.
Yeah, he's there somewhere. I can see his name.
Yeah.
Oh, he's always Mark Carter now, according to this. I don't know what's going on. We're getting him twice.
He must be
There he
important.
Mark's in his car.
Hope you're not driving, Mark.
No, just pulled over the side of the road.
Why have I got you twice, Mark?
I'm just on my phone. I haven't got any other device.
Okay. Well, I've got you twice for some reason. No, now I've got you once, so it's okay.
Oh, good. Great.
I think we'll get started anyway, folks. So thanks for coming along. And welcome to the Saturday morning of Beneath the Wisteria. As you know, we usually meet face-to-face in the Maud Street Mill, Beneath the Wisteria. But because of COVID-19, we've been meeting virtually. Sorry, I'm just admitting somebody else. And the lockdown is loosening a bit, so hopefully we'll be meeting face-to-face again fairly soon. Today's meeting is being hosted from the lands of the Yorta Yorta people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners of the land. I'd also like to pay my respects to them, wish to acknowledge them as, I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Also acknowledge that Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be with us today. Importantly, it must be noted that these lands have never been ceded. Our special guest today is Professor John Quiggin. However, before I hand over to John, there's a couple of housekeeping matters. Please put yourself on mute, as that will help cut out any background noise. And of course, unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. We'll have a Q&A after John has spoken, and I'll attempt to keep some order to that, but I'll need your help, so be patient. It is my hope to have today's meeting wrapped up by midday. Next on the Beneath the Wisteria series will be a Professor of Communication from the Deakin University, Matthew Ricketson, who will be with us on Wednesday, October 14 at 10 a.m. And he can talk about the coverage of the climate crisis by the media. I'll circulate details of that pretty soon. Now back to today. John is a professor in economics at the University of Queensland and is prominent both as a research economist and as a commentator on Australian economic policy. He understands decision theory, environmental economics, production economics, and the theory of economic growth. He's also written on policy topics including climate change, microeconomic reform, privatisation, employment policy, and the management of the Murray-Darling River system. He told me that he would say something today about the federal government's recently announced technology roadmap. As an aside, John has a family relationship with Shepparton, as his great-grandfather owned a timber yard just east of Shepparton, and we now have a Quiggin court not far from where I live. So it's with certain delight. Over to you, John. And if you want to share your screen, I can set you up for that.
No, I'm just going to talk. So,
okay. Okay.
So that's fine. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm acknowledge I'm coming speaking to you from the lands of the Yagara people here in Brisbane, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So a lot's been happening in climate, despite the fact, of course, all our attention's been focused on the pandemic. We had catastrophic bushfires last year. It may have some reprieve this year, but the Western United States certainly didn't, and that problem is going to keep coming back. And we've seen a very mixed picture in the response from the federal government to everything following the pandemic. So in the immediate arrival of the pandemic, after briefly trying to hold the line, they rapidly embraced the same kinds of responses as the Rudd government introduced in response to the global financial crisis, a very large-scale fiscal stimulus, and particularly from Morrison, some talk about that from now on we do things differently, not go back to the same old debates. On the other hand, almost everything we hear from Josh Frydenberg could have been said a year ago with almost no change, just trying to return things as soon as possible to the same failed policies of the past. And we can see that kind of mixture. We were just having little in-net problems, and of course there's also been a pretty major reversal of government policy in relation to the NBN. That's something they were bagging out for many, many years, saying we didn't need high quality internet for everybody, and suddenly they've realised we do. So that kind of very mixed picture is also very much evident in the government's response to climate change. We saw very bizarrely people big in the gas industry being appointed to this government's so-called COVID Commission. And if you can cast your minds back to March and April, which is very difficult, you'll remember that we're facing huge problems in things like sourcing masks and other equipment. And the billing for this commission, and you can read the terms of reference, was they were going to hire people who are experts in logistics, so like somebody from Toll Holding, Australia Post, Greg Combay, a bunch of people who knew how to get things moving in the very precise sense of saying, we need to make sure there are enough masks in hospitals when they're needed, that these kinds of organisational responses to the pandemic are handled properly. If they did any of that at all, it was not in the least bit apparent. Instead, what we had was the appointment of Nev Power, a gas executive, as chairman of the commission, and he came up with a long-term economic strategy which bore no relationship whatsoever to the pandemic. Was just something, obviously, that he had always thought was a good idea. So it's unclear how much of this was planned by the government and how much of it just happened. So in any case, this process, the COVID Commission process, was running in parallel with the government's which was a pre-existing process. To of course go back to the pre-pandemic situation, we're in a situation where the government has repeatedly tried to formulate a policy of some kind to deal with climate, and repeatedly failed, essentially because the group of climate denialists, led until recently by Tony Abbott, but also represented by Barnaby Joyce and Craig Kelly, people of this kind, essentially put a veto on anything that might happen. And clearly the government had a political problem here, that although it could pretend that it was going to meet its commitments in a same. In the absence of any coherent policy that can possibly be represented as having a price, they set people to work on this technology roadmap idea that we would look at the technologies we needed and somehow wish them into existence. So these two things are going along in parallel and have more or less reached fruition about the same time. And so to look at the positives, one effect of this, recognised both by supporters of coal within the government and within the political right, people like Greg Sheridan, and by some opponents, is the government has finally moved past the idea that coal-fired power is the way of the future. They've now solidly fixed on a combination of gas and a bunch of future technologies they hope will go well. On the other hand, they haven't abandoned their pretty remorseless hostility to solar PV and wind. So all of this doesn't make any coherent sense. It's essentially just trying to sweeten a bunch of different constituencies particularly within the government. So I much about the gas part of the strategy. I suppose I'll observe that it just continues a trend where we are some years behind most of the other countries. So if we look at Europe and North America, in those everywhere in Europe and North America, the issue of coal is almost over. The last coal-fired power stations are being closed on a yearly basis. By 2030, there'll only be a handful left in Europe, and probably less than 10% of US electricity will be supplied by coal. The issue now is when growth in electricity demand resumes, will that be met by gas, as it has been reasonably successfully for much of the period since 2000, or will it be met by a combination of solar PV and wind backed up by battery storage? And pretty clearly the answer that's coming out of the US in particular, which is the most comparable to us, is that renewables and storage between them are dominating gas as a source of new supply. So the government has finally caught up to where other countries were 5 years ago, that there's no future at all in coal. I think they've still, of course, got their inquiry going into the idea of a coal-fired power station in Collinsville, but I don't think that's $3 million of public money to answer a question which anybody who looks at it can answer very quickly, that there is no way that such a thing can be economically viable. So we'll wait and see how far gas thing goes, because another notable thing is that the government has talked of building a gas-fired power station itself. Of course, in a broad sense, there's a positive recognition that the days when we say, oh, look, governments just don't do this kind of thing anymore, all this stuff should be done by the private sector, is well and truly out. That's important for considering a bunch of future initiatives we might want to take. Looking at the technology roadmap, there's a very mixed bag. The crucial thing is that a lot of it is purely magical thinking. So, for example, if we look at carbon capture and storage, which is one of the things a big deal was made about, the government's planning on putting $50 million into CCS, and the technology roadmap has as what's called a stretch goal, reducing the cost of CCS to $20 a tonne of carbon dioxide sequestered. Now, this is very much like me saying I'm a follower of the Geelong Football Club. I'm going to send them $10, and my stretch goal is that they should win every match for the next 5 years. There's simply no relationship between the amount of money they're putting in and what would be needed in investment to achieve this goal, if indeed it could be achieved. Indeed, Australia, only 10 years ago, had a $2 billion fund for precisely this purpose, to invest in CCS. At that time, when it seemed much more promising, and in the end, I couldn't find any worthwhile projects to spend it on. The coal industry took some of the money and started spending it on ads about how good coal was. And in the end, Joe Hockey, when he was treasurer, one of his few good decisions was to say, look, we're just going to take this money back and put it in the budget. So that's characteristic in general of the technology roadmap, is there's a description of the technologies they would like to happen, but there is particularly in the case of CCS, there isn't the funding to make it happen. And there's still attempts, for example, to, that's the failure of CCS is important also because that then relates to their approach to hydrogen. Hydrogen, in one form or another, is likely to be a major part of the electricity transition in the future as a replacement for, in fact, as a replacement for gas. So obviously both gases, a replacement for methane gas, natural gas. There are two processes, and also as an input into steel production, replacing metallurgical coal. Now, there's two main processes for producing hydrogen. One is from lignite, brown coal, and the other is using electricity, which can be generated from any source, to split water. Water is H2O, and so if you put enough electricity through it, you get a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, and you can use hydrogen as fuel. The government is primarily backing the lignite approach on the assumption that it won't generate additional emissions because a carbon capture and storage process can be invented that will solve that problem for them. Now, that's highly unlikely to happen, and so that whole process of magical thinking leads to a significant distortion in the way the government has been approaching the issue. But at the same time, I suppose I'll just come back to the positives, which is that we have seen an implicit, at least, admission that first, that there's not going to be any more new coal-fired power, and second, that the government has largely given up digging its heels in on the idea of a gradual closure of our existing coal-fired power stations. Sadly, of course, Labor's in a total mess about this, they have no idea what they want to say or who they should say it to, and we're unlikely to see much progress from within the Australian political system on this. The likelihood is that if anything's to happen, it's going to come externally, and that comes in two forms. First, the government is trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union. The European Union has made it very clear that that won't happen as long as we don't have a price on carbon. As far as they're concerned, that's an unfair trade practice on our part. And the government is still, as in many things, in a state of denial on this. They can't actually believe the world has changed so much that a major power like the EU would refuse an appealing-looking free trade agreement over climate. They're still, because of course they're still reading the Australian and the Financial Review and other papers saying it's all a load of nonsense and we should forget about it. So there's been really a state of denial by the Australian negotiators on this. The second thing is, assuming that Biden wins the US election, he's looking at China, which has also been dragging its feet, and saying, rather than more or less arbitrary protectionism as practiced by Trump, he's going to introduce tariffs on China based on their failure to put an end to coal-fired power. The Chinese are already starting to work up to this, and have issued things like a promise to be carbon neutral by 2060. So it looks as though, at least rhetorically, they're preparing themselves for this. But of course, if Biden introduces such a policy, it has to be it can't be directed specifically against China. It has to be directed against all countries pursuing these unfair trading practices, and Australia is the head of that list. So we're in a situation where quite easily in a year's time, we could be facing both import tariffs directly imposed on us by the United States and refusal by the EU to negotiate a trade agreement, combined, of course, with the likelihood that China will, because of our other disputes with China, seek to displace Australian coal exports in particular from its market, and then combined with the fact that other major markets like Japan and Korea are moving away from coal. So some of this is percolating through the government's thinking, and the optimistic story is they're going for gas because it's something they want to talk about, because it's much easier for them to make this transition by talking about gas, just as, of course, they're saying their NBN strategy is marvellous. This was precisely the right time. The problem with Rudd's NBN wasn't that fibre to the curb was bad, it was that just he wanted to do it too early. So the optimistic view is this is a rhetorical cover for something which will eventually move to a proper transition. I think in these times, predicting which of these things will happen is a very difficult task. If I'd been talking to you a year ago and I'd said, what are the odds in a year's time the government will double the dole? I would have said, well, about the same as they'll appoint me as Prime Minister. And who knows, they might appoint me as Prime Minister, I guess. Anything can happen in these circumstances. So I won't predict, other than to say there clearly is a tension within, there's a tension within the government between instinctively reaching back to the old bag of policies, which is what Freidenberg is mostly doing, and realising the world has fundamentally changed, and that the constraints, both political and economic, on what they can do are radically different from what they were in the past. And there's the same mess going on in the Labor Party as there typically is in the aftermath of an unexpected defeat, between attempting to refight the last election with different policies and thinking about what they're actually going to need in the future. So I might stop there and we could start the Q&A, I guess, if that suits people.
Yeah, thanks, John. That was great. We just have one question on the Q&A from John, I think it was.
Two questions from Greg, I think.
Oh, Greg, sorry, yeah.
So I think I'll talk about growth. I mean, I don't, on the whole, regard growth as being any longer a useful concept. There's a 20th century model of the economy, which is basically, most of us are an age where we learned this one at school, primary, secondary and tertiary industry. So primary industry is farmers and miners. They grow stuff, dig stuff up. Secondary industry is manufacturing, turns that into useful products. Tertiary industry is transport, retail and wholesale, takes these products and gets them onto the shopping shelves where we buy them. And then there's a bunch of add-ons that we don't really think very much about. Aged care and schools and the financial sector and of course, not the internet because it wasn't there. In the 21st century economy, that old goods economy now accounts for less than half of employment, and that share is steadily diminishing. So the answer, so why does this matter? Because the only way you can have more of that kind of economy is through what traditionally thought of as growth, more throughput. We dig up more stuff, we process it and sell it. By contrast, when we look at the service economy, there isn't any real constraint of that kind. That is, we're doing this internet talk, or talking to each other from different parts of the country. 20 years ago, we could, with great difficulty, have organised this through a phone hookup or something, perhaps. But we're using no more resources to do what we're doing now than the phone hookup would have taken 20 years ago. And the same with all of the things we do on the internet are using no more resources than they were in the past. My computer, which in some measures is 10,000 times as powerful as the computer I had 20 years ago, is actually smaller, uses less electricity, less material inputs of all kinds. And similarly with health and education and aged care, we can do more and better of all of these kinds of things without using more resources. So my answer is, when we talk about terms of growth, we're thinking of more of everything expanding greatly. What we have to look forward in the future, what the Australian Conservation Foundation and a great piece called Better Than Growth, we can have improved living standards, but that will be in the form of more and better services with a more or less finite, with essentially very little further growth in material consumption. Next question is Labor ducking the issues because they're fighting the Conservatives? Yes, the answer, that clearly is the case. And of course the fact that a significant number of them are Conservatives. So there's a group of people for whom who genuinely would like to do stuff but are frightened. Another group of people who never want to do anything, whose real view is simply they're the Silvertails team, we're the workers team. We don't need to have any different policy. It's just that if you're workers, you should vote for us because we're the workers team. That's pretty much the view. If you read, Nick Dyrenfurth had a piece on Blue Labor, and I saw Claire O'Neill saying the same thing. The point is simply, you should vote for us because we're the people you should vote for, just as I wouldn't switch from supporting Geelong to supporting Carlton just because Carlton had better players in some given year. That's really the political view those people have.
John, what impact has the COVID-19 crisis had on the economy?
Well, so it has obviously the short-term impact of making it impossible to do a whole bunch of things. So we can't now. in the case of Queensland, what we're mostly limited on now is we can't leave the state. I almost did a couple of months ago and could have been trapped on the wrong side of the border, so it'll be a while before we go anywhere. And of course, no one can come here. Hopefully that will be changed a little bit soon too. But the result is, of course, that there's a significant impact on anything that depends on interstate and international travel. With the high degrees of lockdown, of course, that's all sorts of things simply can't be done until those lockdowns are lifted. And so that's a loss of output, which is more or less permanent. Then there's a question of when this is all unwound, will we have a consequential series of business failures of people being unemployed who can't get back into work, which leads to recession? And there it depends on what kind of policies are adopted by the government in the next budget. And sadly, the signs aren't very good. They're talking very much about bringing forward a tax cut for high income earners, but high income earners, by definition, haven't lost their job, but they wouldn't be high income earners. As a group, they've been piling up, I should say, since I'm one of them, have been piling up money we can't spend. The idea that giving us more is going to lead us to spend more is just silly. And so, at the same time, the government is cutting its increased unemployment benefit, which is something, which is money that certainly would have been spent. So, so that's sort of the macro picture, as it were. We also see, I think, the acceleration of a bunch of trends that were happening anyway. I've already mentioned the decline of coal-fired power. There's been, of course, a decrease in demand for electricity in most places in the world as a result of the pandemic. That decrease has fallen almost entirely on coal, and that's accelerated the plans to retire coal-fired power stations in lots of jurisdictions. Even places like Poland, which was holding out, the last European country to really hold out hard against cuts in coal, is moving very rapidly in that direction now. And we've also seen, as everybody has got more or less used to Zoom, an acceleration in a trend towards remote working and remote meeting. So obviously I'm doing this meeting. I was chatting to Rob a year or so ago and thinking, maybe sometime I'll get down to Shepherd to come out and meet you guys, and that might perhaps still happen. But I imagine that 90% of the time from now on, when somebody says, let's have a meeting, in the past, when I've always been in favour of remote working, I'd say, look, I don't really want to come. Can I do this remotely? And they say, oh, it's so difficult. We have to organise this and they're not set up. And why don't you just fly down and we'll put you up in a hotel? I can't imagine anybody taking that view in the future. If they say, look, here's this meeting, we want to have people from 4 different states. Do we want to have somebody organising flights and hotels and this kind of stuff, or do we just all get together on Zoom? Mm-hmm. I think the answer 90% of the time will be all get together on Zoom. And so since this kind, that's the extreme case, but I think also even just ordinary old office meetings, if you say, are we all going to meet together in the 10 of us in the conference room for the foreseeable future, a really big conference room, we're all spaced far apart. We've got 2 people who say they can't make it, but they can call in by Zoom. If you've ever tried 8 people in a conference with 2 on Zoom, it's a disaster. So I think we'll see that kind of thing continuing to emerge, even though plenty of people don't like it. I think the people who do like it now have the power of initiative, whereas previously the default was always be physically present or be out. But I think now it's just going to be very difficult to organise large in-person meetings.
John,
so
John,
I think that kind of shift.
Sorry, John.
Yeah.
I was going to say, John, one of those with us today is Mark Carter from Flight Free Australia. So what impacts has the flight thing had on Australia's economy?
Well, obviously a huge impact on the on air travel and on any business that's dependent specifically on international or mostly interstate tourism. So if you look at Queensland, of course, roughly speaking, we come out about even on tourism. Lots of Australians go overseas and travel interstate, and lots of people come here. So what you see is that the places that Queenslanders like to go are heavily booked because the alternative of going somewhere else isn't there, whereas the places that cater specifically to international tourists, Cairns and parts of the Gold Coast, are suffering pretty badly. I expect that this is something where, of course, people's money has been saved up.
So what's the long-term
people,
goal?
of course, have just said, look, I don't really feel...
John Pettigrew's got a question.
You're muted.
You're asking me to ask a question, Rob?
No, John Pettigrew.
Yeah.
John. Yep, okay. Yeah, I've got a question when John...
Yeah.
You're muted, John. You're muted, John.
He spoke a moment ago.
Yeah, I know.
I'll start again. John, one of the distortions, the distortion of the marketplace is also distorting decision-making, business decisions right across the nation. Key to it is no cost of emissions on current and future generations. Without that, it's difficult to see any reasonable policy decisions, business decisions being made that suit us the long term. Is there any way that we can get in some sort of de facto cost? Is there another way of doing this?
Yep. I'll just quickly finish off on the travel thing and just say my long-term prediction is that we'll see a pretty rapid recovery in recreational and family type travel. Basically, I think as soon as people are confident they can get a flight and get back again without having to go into quarantine. I know I'm certainly hanging out to visit the grandkids, and I can't imagine that I'm alone. I think we're going to see a permanent reduction in business travel, and it will take quite a while, I think, to restore to the previous level. So I just want to finish off on that. Right. And what we've seen, I think, is attempt to find some way of packaging that price in a way that Tony Abbott couldn't sniff it out. And he could always, I guess he had his Jesuit training, he could always smell out heresy whenever he needed to. What we're seeing in the technology roadmap, in many ways, is more the same, in the sense that they're still resisting a new renewable energy target, which is one way. But the only thing we had which did have this effect was the renewable energy target. It effectively put a price on non-renewable energy, which wasn't very well designed, but sort of had that effect. Essentially, I think, looking at the hopelessness of our major parties, a new renewable target is really the only way we're going to get anywhere. Of course, we do have some of that at the state level. So that's really the only policy we have that's doing anything worthwhile.
Derek, you had a question?
Yeah, John, Professor Garno and others have said we could become an exporter of hydrogen to Asia and our neighbours. But there's a counter view that because of the pandemic, there's more likelihood that that countries, particularly within the Sunbelt, they'll want to be independent in terms of their energy supply. They won't be too interested in our hydrogen exports in the future. What's your view on how that all might play out?
Well, I think independent of the pandemic, there's obviously been something, obviously been a breakdown to some extent of the globalised economy that had developed. On the other hand, cheap is cheap. I think, although there's, of course, long been everywhere a preference for self-sufficiency in food, but that hasn't stopped us exporting lots of wheat and lots of beef because we have cheap, high quality wheat and beef, and it's whatever, say, a country like Japan, however much they might like to produce their own, clearly they can't do so on a scale and at a cost that's satisfactory. So I think the logic of cheap power mostly will prevail. A separate question is whether we should be looking at if we do manage to get into export, whether that should be in the form of hydrogen or electricity itself through high voltage direct current lines. So that's another possible export approach we can take. Of course, this is for countries which have less, don't have the very favourable situation we have, of very large areas of land and very high insulation. There are plenty of countries less favourably placed than we are to whom we could export either electricity or hydrogen. So I think there is a significant prospect there, and obviously we want, as I've said, it needs to be the case that the hydrogen is generated using electricity rather than from lignite, as has been the preferred model of the government so far.
Alfred, you had a question.
Another question in... Yes, I can see the question here.
Yeah.
So coming back, there's been no real likelihood of inflation. I think central banks everywhere would like more inflation rather than less, and they've had great trouble getting there. So I think the capacity of the economy to pile up significant money balances is there. The other point which I want to stress about the future, and which is important and which is good for climate change mitigation, is long-term interest rates have fallen to zero and appear set to stay there at least through the lifetime of everybody in this meeting. The Australian government is currently selling 30-year bonds at an interest rate of around 1%. The Austrian government just sold 100-year bonds at a rate of 1%. So what that means is that the capital repayment required from an investment in a renewable source that has essentially no operating costs can be defrayed over the entire life of the project with no real return to capital, or essentially zero real return to capital required. That means that the cost at which renewables can deliver electricity is going to continue to drop, and I don't see any prospect that those real rates of interest are going to rise significantly in the next 10 years, which is the crucial period of time. That we could be surprised, but I think it's clear that that we've got both long-term and short-term forces effectively pushing interest rates down to zero, and that's great for socially desirable investments.
But how do you explain that everybody is borrowing money? So money is scarce, so inflation should rise like mad, like it did 70, 80 years ago in Germany. But it doesn't seem to do that.
Money isn't scarce, I think, is the point. That is...
everybody wants it.
It's scarce. Everybody wants it, but everybody also... everybody who isn't retired wants to save for their retirement, and the private sector, that means lending to somebody who's going to invest. The private sector doesn't want the money. I have a whole series of blog posts on this. You look at the big 5 tech companies which dominate the US stock exchange. Essentially, they spend almost nothing on investment. All they do is collect the rent on the monopoly properties they own, just like when you land on Mayfair and Park Lane in the game Monopoly. They bought everything they need already. Google has its network, Apple has its technology, and so forth. And so these funds, the so-called savings glut, which was identified 15 years ago, are piling up with nowhere to go. And the pandemic has only accelerated that. We've had 6 months and maybe longer when lots of the stuff which people with money would normally spend their money on isn't available. That's piled up into savings. People have paid down their debts, and that means the people who've had those repayments made to them have to find someone else to lend the money to. And really, only governments are there with their hand out, and they need to put their hand out for a lot more as soon as possible.
Okay.
What about you, Lou Cook? You're always on about money. He's got... You must have a question, surely.
You may have frozen. Okay.
You're on mute, Lou.
I see that. Well, a couple of months ago, I watched a webinar on the Australia Institute.
Mm.
Stephanie Kelton.
Oh, yep.
Stephanie Kelton's written a book called The Deficit Myth.
I have read that book.
Beg your pardon? The book was called The Deficit Myth.
Yes, I've read it.
You've read it. Well, where the hell does money come from? I've written to the Reserve Bank, and the blokes up there, they don't care as long as we're all kept with our nose to the grindstone. And I guess I'm a bit of a bloody skeptic, because all of this discussion is political, and at the moment, what politician can you trust? You know, I really am skeptical about all of this. And but money, I just hate to think what's going to happen. Josh Frydenberg is trying to soften us up for more taxes and charges, and it's just going to get right. I think it'll get right out of hand, and I don't know what'll happen when they stop JobKeeper. We're going to have more unemployed people. You're going to have more people parading the streets, and coming back to what John said, I use less or no more kilowatt hours now than I did 20 years ago. And my power bill each month is now more than it was for 6 months 20 years ago. The cost of supplying power here has risen probably 10 times in 20 odd years. And I just can't see how the hell you've got too many people making big, vast profits. In the energy sector, the investors, they're the worst bloody people in the world. They don't care as long as they get their interest. They don't care what they do to the environment. I'm not bloody joking.
Can you give us a question, Lou?
Yeah. What are you going to do about it?
Well, as I say, the first step in my program is that the government should recognise that I'd be a really good Prime Minister and put me in. But that's the wishful thinking. Lots of points there. So I will just say, well, two things. One is it certainly, you could say, looks as if Josh Frydenberg read Stephanie Kelton's book, because no one needs any convincing anymore that that we're going to be in deficit for a very long time to come, and we should all get over worrying about it. I'll briefly say, where does money come from? I do have an answer for that one. The answer is, comes to a question about taxes. What governments do is collect taxes, and what money is something the government says, if you bring me this, I will accept that in payment of my taxes. And that's how indeed they brought non-monetary economies like those in East Africa into money. The government, the British came there, they made coined a whole lot of Kenyan shillings, and then went out and told everybody, if you've got a hut, we have a hut tax, you need to bring us a shilling for your hut. And how can you get a shilling? The answer is, well, fortunately, we have plenty of them. If you come and work for us, we'll give you shillings and you can pay the tax. And that's where money comes from.
Can I answer that? Money, first thing is, what is money, John? Money is a means of exchange. Money is a man-made system to exchange goods and services. And there's no limit on the amount of money that can be printed, or with it. The only limit on the money that can be manufactured is dependent on the wherewithal of the people of the nation. It's not, you can't build anything if you haven't got the materials or the expertise. Anything that can be done should be financially capable of being done. It doesn't matter what it is. And you've got people, it's a question of power. Who controls the money? And I think it was Amschel Rothschild said about 1836, permit me to control the money of a nation, note this carefully. Permit me to control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes the rules. And it means the control of finance is above government. No government can go to war without the backing of international finance. It costs a hell of a lot of money to put an F-111 in the air or a battleship at sea, and it requires the support of big finance. The only problem here, if you break down the war industries, how are you going to get money in the pockets of the people that will be unemployed? The whole thing feeds on itself.
Is that a little, I think?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't get me started.
Well, we have, Lou.
Yeah, no, I'll leave that as a comment, I think.
Okay. Any other questions?
We haven't heard anything from any of the ladies, I think. So if any,
I'm sure Val would have a question.
Yeah, down by the men.
You're on mute, Val.
On mute.
There you go. Are you still on mute, Val?
There we go.
Right,
There we go. Oh, I've got lots of questions. Most of them are just heartbreaking questions. John, I would vote for you to be Prime Minister tomorrow, in case you don't know, because both parties. I'm trying not to be hopeless and despair and all of those things, but signing petitions and these guys that you're talking to keep me from going completely hiding under a blanket. But we just have to keep on going, and we have to think about the future and support any way we can.
I agree. I mean, I think we each do a little bit. I mean, I've with a reasonable amount of public prominence, been involved in lots and lots of things, and most of them have come to nothing. But every now and then something gets improved a bit, and I can say, yeah, well, I think I helped there. So I think that's just what we have to keep on doing. I mean, we have in many looking at say 200 years since Europeans arrived here, we've in many ways made this a better society, certainly for the people who've arrived here, and we are trying at least now to fix up some of the harm we've done to the people we displaced and pushed aside as we came here. So I think you can look at that history and point to plenty of bad things that have happened, but also plenty of good things, and I think we just have to keep on.
We have to concentrate on those, John, and that's what I do. I get lovely thank you messages from Get Up. I'm one of those, I'm not cashed up, but I'm an activist with Get Up.
John, we've got a question from Jeff Hodge. Jeff Hodge.
John, I've actually got two questions. The first one will be in relation to the announcement of the funding schedule for the next 10 years for ARENA. I'm wondering if you'd like to make some comments on that, because there's a significant shift in direction, and I certainly have some reservations in what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Sure. No, I think, I mean, the idea, the government still hasn't got its head around the idea that as long as we don't have a carbon price, everything, renewables are being taxed. So I think that, and there's, although there's certainly an attempt to pick winners, they aren't really picking winners in the sense of saying, let's look at what are the best prospects for Australia. They're looking at trying to be somewhat realistic, but basically saying what will play well with the relevant political constituencies. So I suppose, as I generally, if you look at the package and say, where does this stand in relation to good public policy, the answer is a long way away. The best you can say is, where does it stand compared to what the loonies on the government backbench want? And the answer is, it's a big step forward relative to that.
Do you have another question, Jeff?
Yeah, look, my next question is in relation to Helen Haynes, the independent member for Indi. She launched a community power plan this week. My question is, are you familiar with that plan, and do you have a comment?
So I'm not familiar with the plan in detail, but clearly, clearly there's a potential relevance because of, our institutional setup. One of the few things where there is a standing implicit price on carbon and an implicit benefit for renewables is in rooftop solar, and we've been doing this on an individual basis, but system by which we can organise this at a community level, I think have a great deal of potential. I haven't seen the detail of this, but there are a lot of schemes of this kind. Actually quite a lot in the US, more than here, that take advantage of the benefits of rooftop solar without requiring each individual household to make a separate deal with the supplier. So the general type of initiative is very positive, but I don't know anything about the details of this one.
John Pettigrew had a question. You're on mute, John.
John, I think it is tied into Jeff Lodge's question, and that is at a time like this, rather than looking at gas projects and, God forbid, dam building, we seem to have overlooked the interconnectivity of our resources across the nation, and we know from solar farm developments here in the Goulburn Valley that we're having real trouble with connecting into the grid. The grid is not fit for purpose into the future.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we get this on the agenda at the moment?
Well, I mean, it is on the agenda, but I mean, Lou mentioned the huge increases in power prices. We've had this reform. I just used the word reform to mean change. These reforms introduced in the 1990s, which have spectacularly failed in every respect, and one of them is having a properly planned transmission and distribution network with, in this case, a pseudo market that just doesn't work very well. Now they are among the alphabet soup. The Australian Energy Market Operator, I think, is trying to fix these things, and the other acronym, his name is escaping me now, are still making a mess of things. So I think we are seeing some movement on it, but we're trapped in the legacy of just pass-fail policies in a way that's very difficult to fix.
John, you were involved with the Climate Commission, I think, weren't you? So
I was involved with the Climate Change Authority. I was a member of that for 5 years. I resigned in process against Josh Frydenberg, actually, who was then the Minister for the Environment, who just ignored our reports.
Another question from Lou.
John, just for somebody's information, I've got solar panels here, got it on three roofs. Now, what is the effective life of a solar panel?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm way outside my area of expertise here, but they've been typically sold with a lifetime of, I think, 20 years, but the evidence seems to be they last longer. The real issue is, I think, I have solar panels too. The real issue is the improvements are such that that it may well be better to scrap your existing solar panels and replace them with new ones, even while they're operational, simply because of the gains in efficiency. I must admit I haven't bitten that bullet myself, but I would say that rather than ceasing to work, the main issue is simply that you can get a newer and better one. Much the same, I guess, as is the case with computers, that most of the time you don't throw out your computers or stop working, you throw it out because it's too slow, because it's working just as well as it did 10 years ago. Yeah.
So Jeff Lodge can answer that question, Lou.
Yeah, look, I'd like to, Rob, just to put it in context. There's a couple of ways of answering the question. The first thing is typically a solar system, the solar panels will lose effectiveness in the order of 1% a year. So in 50 years, the panel will be operating at about 50% capacity. The other way of answering the question is the performance warranty. And typically, exclusively, the Australian government has a standard, and that is that all solar panels that are manufactured or imported into Australia must have a performance warranty where at 10 years, they will be operating at 90% capacity, and at 20 years, they will be operating at 80% capacity. So they're the two answers. So essentially 1% a year is what you'll lose in its performance. I'll pick up on John's comment about replacing solar panels. And I'm seeing this trend and I'm very concerned about it because of the market mechanisms that are in place. So solar panels, when they're installed, they claim a small, what's called an STC, a small technology certificate, which is essentially the carbon savings that are generated from the solar. You can sell them into the marketplace. It is assumed that the solar panels will generate a saving over a period of time. The time is measured to 2030. So when a system today is being decommissioned, it's still got 10 years of generation that is expected and forecast and traded. So when you install a solar system, you are assuming that the system will produce carbon benefits to 2030. A system that is decommissioned early will be in debt. And this is a concern to me. So when I see systems being decommissioned and replaced, they are getting new credits when they, in my opinion, they should not be getting new credits on the same site unless the deficit is deducted from that. So to me, it's a market failure. And I'm very concerned about this in terms of the false accounting in our carbon savings that have been applied in recent time. Would you like to make a comment on that, John?
No, look, I mean, it's great. One of the good things about coming to this kind of meeting is, on issues like this, which obviously I'm not a real expert on, you find people in the meeting know more than you do, so I usually go learning something.
John Pettigrew's got a question.
Yeah, just a quick comment there. The same could be said for carbon in soils. Carbon certainly builds up and depletes over years. For any genuine market in carbon in soils, it's going to be a win and payback situation. I would have thought. I don't know how we're going to do it.
I mean, here from being on the Climate Change Authority, I know that soil carbon is highly problematic. It's something that it's one of those things I was talking about, which, if it worked, would meet all sorts of desirable characteristics. CCS is like this. We've got lots of coal. If we could have somehow found some way of taking the carbon dioxide away and getting rid of it for nothing, it would be great for Australia. And similarly, soil carbon is a great way, if it worked, would be a great way of getting farmers on board and achieving stuff while getting outside the debate over electricity generation and stuff. But it is highly problematic as a technology.
We'll get one more question from Lou, and then we're going to have to go because it's almost 12 o'clock.
Who's collecting my carbon credits, John?
So if you when you bought the system, the person you bought it from will have cashed in the carbon credits and hopefully passed on most of the proceeds to you as a discount. That's why people can offer essentially stuff to nothing or very little down, because the benefit to them is the credits.
Okay, thanks.
Just quickly, Rob.
And the electricity retailers are the major purchasers.
Yes.
Of these credits, because they've got mandated targets they must meet.
Exactly.
And that's where they're buying their credits from.
We've got one more question from Val. We better go.
Yeah, it's sort of just a comment. Did anyone see the Finland program on SBS the other night where they're stopping the peat? Oh, it was marvellous. They're doing immense work because they're worse than brown coal. They use peat to burn.
I haven't.
It was fantastic, and they are talking about ground and carbon and stuff. They are just doing marvellous stuff. It's sort of uplifting, really.
Okay, folks, it's 12 o'clock, so we best go.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah.
We'll give a hand to John. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. It was great.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on.
Sort of responding. Yeah, just quickly responding to Val. Don't give up hope. I mean, the situation is dire but not hopeless. So I think the more we all push, the better a chance we have. And
Like
thanks
a
very
fox
much for
terrier,
inviting me,
a fox
and
terrier
hope to actually
dog,
make it in
John.
person to Shepparton.
Never give in.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that.
Okay, great.
Thank-
Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for coming, folks. Hope you got some value from that.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much.
Get value every time, Rob. Marvellous.
Yeah.
Take care.
You too, Val.
See you
Okay.
later.
Yeah, see you guys. See you, Jeff. See you,
I
Mark.
like it being on Zoom, Rob, because I can come to every one of them.
Yeah, it's true. See you, Jeffrey.